Long before there were any schools established, and long before there was the very first apprentice and mentor or master relationship, before any guru took on disciples, humans have been learning how to do things by watching other humans. That's what we do, whether they're simple tasks like gathering food or more complex things like organizing armies or running governments. One word that's become popular for talking about that type of relationship is mentor, a mentoring relationship. Mentoring is how we learn to do things. And in our community, we use that term to talk about one of the most, perhaps the most important task, learning how to be a good human, a good follower of Jesus. And so we pair up folks in mentoring relationships. And just as an aside, we have, I think on hand right now, about 8 folks willing to play that role of mentor to young men in the community. Or you guys, if I can call you young, you're not 40 yet. So there are adults waiting to serve that role in some of your lives. So I'd encourage some of you guys who don't have a relationship with someone like that to pursue one. Standing next to me here, this guy, Steve Garber, he's been a mentor to me for half my life. He's been someone I've watched, sometimes from a distance, sometimes up close. He knows my life in some of the most intimate moments, and has, for me, consistently and faithfully been someone I can watch to learn. What does it mean to be a good human? What does it mean to follow Jesus well in this complex and fallen world that we live in? So it's been a delight to have Steve with us for a couple days with the student ministry leaders, and I'm so glad that he can share time with all of us this morning. Please welcome Steve Garber.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Gordon community. I've had a long interest in this place and even a long love for this place, so it's a gift for me to be back among you. So, good morning to you. Almost 100 years ago, a 10-year-old girl said to her parents in Paris, "I want to be a communist. I want to be a communist." Their words sound strange to us 100 years later because communism, for the most part, has fallen on itself in the world and imploded finally, and we seem to have moved on beyond communism and Cold Wars. And yet, for this little girl whose name was Simone Weil, she was morally serious about her claim to her parents, "I want to be a communist." For some reason, as a 10-year-old, she had already determined there were things not right in the world, things that she wanted to address with her own life. And for her, in her own 10-year-old heart and mind, it seemed like perhaps it was that the communist vision best addressed those injustices, best addressed those things which simply seemed so wrong to her little heart. For the next 10 years, she kept away, moving on into a deeper sense of what it meant to see the world in those terms. She went off to the Sorbonne, the university in Paris, to study philosophy. She was at the very top of her class when she finished. All the while never having met, though, a real communist, a flesh and blood communist. That summer, Leon Trotsky came to Paris, and for the very first time, she had the opportunity to meet somebody who actually was a communist visionary, and she could hardly wait to meet him. The day came, and she met, and they had an evening together with other people, and when the evening was all over, communism was all over for Simone Weil. She found herself profoundly disillusioned by this man who seemed, on the one hand, so eager to take up concerns for humanity. He loved humanity. He was a visionary for humanity, as he put it, really. But she watched him, listened to him, and thought, he doesn't really care about people. He doesn't seem to really care about people. And so she walked away from Paris and communism the next day and spent the next years of her life out among what might have been called the proletariat of France, the farmers, the factory workers, the sufferers, the groaners of France. And somehow, in the longer story that it is, over those next years, she found her way slowly into the God who has tears. The God who has tears. I don't know how really to describe, the nature of conversion. God is the sovereign and merciful one for all of us. It is He whose property it is always to have mercy on you and me and on all who live in his world. But in those next years of life, Simone Weil began to write and to think out of this encounter with the God who has tears. One of the essays which is most interesting to me is one awkwardly titled a little bit. It's not really a very romantic or cut-to-the-chase title. It goes on way too long, but here it is. On the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God. On the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God. And in this essay, she makes the argument that the very heart of the vocation of student is to learn to pay attention. It's a pregnant phrase, to pay attention. But she argues, in fact, that when we learn to learn rightly, when we learn to learn as if somehow the love of God is woven into the very fabric of our learning, we learn to pay attention. And she takes her biblical root in this, her shaping vision from Scripture, from the story that we've just heard. We call it the parable of the Good Samaritan. Walker Percy, wise man that he was, might have called it the story of the man who got all A's and who flunked life. But you know how the story goes. You've been hearing it probably for the years of your life, of an expert in the law, after all. Somebody who's mastered the letter of the law, but somehow has missed the meaning of the law. And he begins to ask questions. Jesus, who is, the reader of the human heart, knows there aren't really honest questions wanting an honest answer. And he won't play an academic game with this man. That's simply the way it is. He won't play an academic game. Where'd you go to school? Who'd you study with? What's your degree like, actually? But he pushes back, and says, you're the expert. How's it read? And finally says, I won't do any more of this, but how about a story for you? Would you like to listen to a story, he says to this expert in the law. And we know how the story goes, don't we? It's a very short story. It's a pretty simple story. It's of two experts in the law who make their own way from Jerusalem to Jericho and see a beaten, bruised man, but who, for historical, theological, sociological reasons, do not see a neighbor. They're able to see but not see. They're able to see but not to care, to know but not to do. And of course, in the surprising way the story is told, the Samaritan, who for no good reasons really, other than somehow he has the ability of heart and mind to actually recognize the neighbor before him, says, what can I do to help you? How can I help you? And he picks him up, and the story's done pretty quickly after that, really. Simone Weil argued that the Samaritan had learned to pay attention. And in his paying attention, she argued, this is what she calls sacramental study. Sacramental study. It's that I want to think with you about this morning. Sacramental study, a vision of sacramental study. To do so, I want to set a little bit of a background to this, what simply could be called the cultural context and challenge. And then secondly, learning to see ourselves as implicated. So it really is just 2 points for you. The cultural context and challenge, and then learning to see ourselves as implicated. As I have watched my own heart and watched the hearts of other people, as I've listened to history, as I read how the world has turned out, it seems to me that as we all take up this most primordial, maybe most perennial of all tasks, what are you going to do with what you know? It's a question that really echoes out from Genesis chapter 3. What will you do with what you know? And as we have answered that millions and millions and millions of ways over the course of millennia, mostly, I would say, we've responded in one of two ways. And they could, with broad brushstroke, be called stoicism and cynicism. Stoicism and cynicism. They're both ways, you see, to protect our hearts from having to care about what we know, to have to love what we know, to have to be implicated by what we know. They allow us to protect ourselves, in some ways to know, but not have to respond, you see. If there's a contemporary Stoic that I've been drawn into, it's the novelist Tom Wolfe. Maybe you've read his work, his essays. I almost always assign his essays to students that I teach. He's remarkably brilliant, finger-to-the-pulse journalist, watching our world and with incredibly astute eyes, it seems to me. But in several of his novels, listening carefully, watching the narrative unfold, what he argues time and again is that you can know, but you don't want to get so close to the knowing that it might hurt you. You don't want to get so close to what you know that, in fact, it might cause you some pain. If we call something like that apathy in our own world, for the Stoic it was the virtue of apatheia that marked their own telos. This was why I would want to be alive. This would be what I am as a human being, is to be somebody marked by apatheia. It was not pejorative for them at all, though. It wasn't something which said, I'm less than. It was really, if I could be all that I might be, a man in full, to quote Tom Wolfe's novel of a few years ago. I would be somebody who would be marked by apatheia. It's a way, you see, to know, to be aware, to have your eyes open, to have your ears open to what's going on, to be fully attentive in some ways, but not to have to get so close to it that you would lose your own happiness. There's more to say. But even if we're not going to be people who become professional Stoics or people who are somehow drawn into the philosophy of Stoicism, I would argue that in the world we live in today, this amusing ourselves to death culture that Postman identified a generation ago, all the way up through the shallows of Nicholas Carr more recently, that there's a sociological Stoicism which affects all of us, whether we think about it or not. Simply to be alive in the modern world in this year 2011 exposes us, we are embedded in the world of sociological Stoicism, which makes it so very difficult, actually, to be attentive to things that matter. How do we watch what goes on in the course of just a day, whether it's in the Twittering world, the Facebooking world, the CNN online world, however it is you keep up with what goes on? What do you do with all that you know? It's almost impossible not to turn the barometer of our hearts down, because you see, how can we respond? How can we? What am I going to do with all that anyway? Well, if Stoicism is its own way of responding, cynicism is on the other side, isn't it? It's its own way of somehow cutting off the connection between knowledge and responsibility, between what I know and how I will live, what I know and what I will love. If there's a contemporary cynic in the novel writing world, I would say it's John le Carré. I've read much of his work, maybe most of his work, in fact. I'm drawn to good writers. I love a good writer. I'm always asking, did you tell a good story? If you told a good story, I'm in. And I love to read people who use words and ideas and bring them together as John le Carré does. But you see, after a career of Cold War novel writing, when the Cold War was done, he began to write about the post-Cold War, this globalizing political economy, which is yours and mine, this early 21st century world where it's big corporations and it's big governments and it's big diseases, and they collide, and who gets crushed? Well, always the one who gets crushed is the small person who can't do anything about it, actually. Because you see, in le Carré's world, everybody messes everybody up. The hard part for me in reading these two novelists is this, these two storytellers is this, that they're almost exactly right. They're almost completely right. It's hard in some ways to actually say no to Wolfe's Stoicism. It's hard almost to say no to the cynicism of le Carré, because you see, when I attend to the world, when I watch what goes on, there's an awful lot of it. It's a very, very, very broken world. And sometimes I feel so weighed down by all that. And when I read them, I think, you are almost right. And I hear that in you. And what I've come to believe, though, is this, that unless there's been an incarnation, unless God actually has known the world and still loved the world, that either of these are actually very good alternatives. They're not finally cheap options after all. They're actually pretty interesting to us, and maybe very important ways to imagine living in the world ourselves. Because why would you want to get so close to what you know that it would hurt you, that it might somehow burden you, that it might somehow implicate you? Both of these are ways to protect our hearts from the responsibility of knowledge, from having to love what we know, from being able to love what we know, which is the very vocation at the heart of sacramental study, which I would argue is the raison d'etre of an institution like Gordon College. Learning to see ourselves as implicated. Some years ago, Gordon got a $2 million grant from the Lilly Endowment, programs in the theological exploration of vocation. 90 schools across the country got grants like this. Boston College got one. Notre Dame got one. 90 schools got them all over the United States. Programs in the theological exploration of vocation. I was drawn into this grant a few years later by the endowment asking, what do you think about what we're doing with this? And I said simply this, while it's a great gift to give this money to Gordon's and to Notre Dames and Dukes and Davidsons and Pepperdine's and on and on and on, really. Actually, the years after you get out of school are harder years. They're more difficult years. Because once a student leaves full of visions of vocation and finding his or her way down into the Bostons of this world, into the New Yorks of this world, up into the Concord, New Hampshires of this world, you see, what they will meet is the realpolitik of the marketplace. And they may be able to find a job. That'd be great, actually, if they get a job, actually. But to find a vocation, that'll be harder, actually. But if the realpolitik of the marketplace was its own great challenge, what I said to the Lily folks was this: there will be a real ecclesiastique in the church that'll be even harder in some ways. Because if the churches they enter into don't preach or pray as if somehow this vision of vocation is a meaningful part of the liturgical life of the congregation, you get to be 28 and 29 and 30, and you look back and think, I didn't know any better when I was 21. It's a great idea, those ivory tower conversations when I was a student at Gordon, but the real world, the real church just isn't like that, is it? I have 3 friends who used to be younger friends, now they're older friends, who at one point in their lives all sat in this room where you're sitting today. They came to be my students in Washington, D.C. over the course of years. One was a young man named Harry Zeiders. Harry grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, from Japanese and Anglo parentage, a sadly broken family. His mother went back to Japan when he was just a little boy. He was raised by his grandparents. Sent off to Gordon, he came to Washington as a political philosophy major with a very bow-tied seriousness about him. Always looked very, very proper. Wanted to go off to do a PhD in political philosophy, and he had a good scholarship offer from Catholic University to do so. But at the very same time that was coming up, his grandparents began to age in a way which he noticed and his family noticed, and who could care for them? Well, Harry seemed to be the only one left to care for his grandparents. So Harry put off his schooling and cared for his grandparents as they died slowly over the next several years. He eventually went off to get a seminary degree and then drawn back into the life of the pastor and the clergy, and for the last number of years actually has been the assistant to the bishop of the Convocation of Anglicans in North America. As I've watched him, as I listen to him, as I take part in his life in some ways, month by month, we have that kind of relationship. I'm impressed, really, that Harry has found a way actually to deepen his vision of vocation over the course of 20 years now. There were unexpected disappointments, and there were burdens upon his life. But you see, rather than being a cynic or a stoic about the worn-outness of this world, the diseases of this world, the deaths of this world, the disappointments of this world, Harry found a way to continue to know what was his to know and to love it at the same time. Jennifer Wolfe was a native of Vermont, came to Washington eventually to study. She came into my life and my classroom, and very bright-eyed and blue-eyed, and great smile, and very gifted as a person, a very wonderful person to meet and to meet other people. And she took her studies seriously. She came back to Gordon. And as I heard the story, there were 2 guys running for student body president that spring, and when she announced that she wanted to run, they both bowed out of the race. And she became the student body president the next year and finished up her years at Gordon. And I got a call from her last week of school here and saying, "What am I going to do now with the rest of my life, Steve?" And I had somebody who I knew was looking for a good person to work under her, and I offered Jennifer to this person. She spent several years working for her, and then I said to Jennifer, "Well, this person over here actually would like to have somebody like you too." So for the next several years, she worked with this person as well. And I've watched Jennifer over the course of years. They get married to somebody named Dano Jokanovic, who was a West Point graduate, and they went for more study and then went off to live in Seattle for several years and adopted a couple of little girls from China along the way. And it's a longer story, but it puts them right now in Kigali in Rwanda, where they're working at microeconomic developments and trying to actually move that into more macroeconomic development for the country of Rwanda. Another young friend of mine who's now older is someone named Santiago Sadaka, who came to Gordon, I think originally from Latin America somewhere, and came to Washington as well to study. He always asked these hardest of questions in class, and I finally remember thinking about Santiago, why don't you just believe us, It's okay, really. But he didn't give up, and we didn't give up, and finally came back to Washington for more graduate study. And it's a longer story, but he finished his studies at Georgetown and then found his way back into my life, into a class I was teaching called Visions of Christian Spirituality, and then brought a girlfriend, Nicole, and Nicole became his wife, and he began to work for for a company funded by USAID, which basically asked Santiago to go around the world month by month to make sure that countries which want USAID funding have workable banking systems or workable judicial systems. Because you see, if the banks don't work in Guatemala, there's no reason actually to give good money to Guatemala. So Santiago works with peoples all over the world, trying to make sure that the infrastructure, politically, economically, is in place. They have 2 little boys now, and we still see them. And somebody told me recently, "You know Santiago?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, he's the best person in the world on these questions. Did you know that, really?" I thought, well, good for you, Santiago. You see, these are all people who have found their way into their 20s, into their 30s, into the realpolitik of the marketplaces of this world, into the real ecclesiastique of the churches of this world, and found a way actually to deepen their convictions about who God is, who they are, what the world is like, rather than inch by inch discard what they once said was so true and mattered so much. Simone Weil, on the very last night of her life, she died way too early. And it's a sad, sad story how it all happened. But she wrote in her journal, the last lines of her journal were these: "The most important task of teaching is to teach what it means to know." The most important task of teaching is to teach what it means to know. In and through our vocations, we take up the vocation of God, brothers and sisters, to know and to love the world at the same time. What does it mean to know? To learn what it means to know is the most important task of teaching, and it's the most important task of learning. May it be so at Gordon College, for students who are beginning your year of study, for professors who are taking up one more year of the work of teaching, for administrators who are stewarding the vision and hope of the institution for this year and years to come. May it be so that this is a place for people who give themselves to the good work of sacramental learning, a kind of learning formed by a common vocation owned by everyone, from freshman to senior professor. May it be that the vision of thy kingdom come is realized, even through a glass darkly, as heaven and earth meet in the minds and hearts of the Gordon community, a community of scholarship and service that it is, as they did for my friends, for Harry, for Jennifer, for Santiago, giving them eyes to see the sacramental character of their study in ways that have formed them for life. May it be so. Amen.